Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Album Analysis. I wanted to switch some things up a little bit this time around. I'm actually going to talk about a book, but it's a music related book. And this book is called Mercury and Me by Jim Hutton. It was released in 1994 and it was out of print for a long time. My copy is on Kindle. I believe you can get hardcover and paperback copies of it, but they're a little harder to get. It's like $4.99 on Kindle, so I would recommend getting it on Kindle, which is where I tracked it down. So anyway, this book was written by Freddie Mercury's husband, Jim Hutton, and it came out 3 years after Freddie Mercury passed away. And it basically just deals with their life together, and from Jim Hutton's point of view, it's a pretty quick read. It's about maybe 225 pages, something like that. It's not a very long book at all. It basically just kind of chronicles from when Jim Hutton met Freddie up until Freddie's death and kind of the fallout of what happened next. Now, this is a very controversial book, actually. A lot of people really came out against Mercury and Me because they felt that it was exploitative, that Jim Hutton was bitter, that he was only in a relationship with Freddie for the money. And there's been a lot of criticisms leveled against the book, particularly that it's putting out details of Freddie's life that should have been kept private, as Freddie was a very private kind of person. But it's interesting because a lot of these same criticisms haven't been leveled against Peter Freestone's book, Freddie Mercury, an Intimate Biography by the Man Who Knew Him Best, which also reveals a lot of Freddie's personal details. But it seemed like Phoebe, as is known, his book got a much more favorable reception by the fans, even though it also reveals a lot of private information about Freddie. Personally, I don't think that either of the books are really exploitative of Freddie, because I think that both books seem to have been written in pretty good taste, I'd say. There's a idea of what exactly a tell-all entails, and that's something that is different kind of based on each person. A lot of people will call Mercury and Me a tell-all, but I think that the idea of a tell-all kind of, it sort of has this image of somebody going, I'm going to get back at that person I was in a relationship with, and I'm going to air all their dirty laundry, basically. And I don't think that was Jim's intent in writing Mercury and Me. He said that he wrote the book basically as a therapeutic process because he was having a lot of trouble in grieving Freddie's death, and by writing about their relationship together, he was able to come to terms with it more. So in that light, let's address just a few short things about the book. I do think you should all read it, so I'm not gonna just rehash everything that's in it. But just a few things. It starts with how Freddie and Jim met, that they had initially met in a club, and then they ran into each other again later, because the first time that they ran into each other, Jim was seeing someone, so he was not available to date Freddie at that time. And then at a later point, they actually were both, well, Jim was single. Freddie still had something going on with Wendy Kirchberger over in Germany, which is addressed later as well. So there's kind of this sort of thread that Jim weaves of there's a lot of conflict between the two of them, because Freddie kind of has other relationships going on, and Jim is sort of feeling like a third wheel to some of Freddie's other stuff that he has going on. But ultimately they did sort of cement their relationship of just the two of them. And of course it deals with Freddie's HIV diagnosis, which he found out in 1987. Jim was one of the first people to find out about Freddie being ill, long before the band did. Jim found out. He was, obviously one of the first people that Freddie told. And just kind of how they dealt with that as well. Jim then later found out he was HIV positive, and he was dealing with that. Freddie's cook, Joe Finelli, also find out he was HIV positive and then ended up passing away about a year or two after Freddie. But so basically, within the cast of characters, without explaining who anyone is, I've name dropped a couple people. So let's backtrack for just a second. Basically, within Mercury and Me, there's a lot of people who are mentioned, but most of the action, for lack of a better term, in a memoir, obviously we've got Freddie. If you don't know who Freddie Mercury is, I don't know why you're watching this video. You found it here somehow. He's the lead singer of Queen. Get yourself together. Jim Hutton, obviously, author of Mercury and Me, employed as a hairdresser when he and Freddie met, and then later as Freddie's gardener after he quit the salon because it came under new management. There's also a fair amount of appearances by Mary Austin, Freddie's ex-girlfriend, still very close. There's a certain amount of friction between Jim and Mary as the sort of two loves of Freddie's life, sort of, and there's a fair amount of sort of jealousy that seems to have occurred on both sides between the two of them, and that's another criticism that has been leveled against Mercury and Me, that Jim only wrote it to get back at Mary Austin, that it's an attack on her, but she really isn't mentioned all that much within the book. There is some mention of fallout between when Mary inherited the house from Freddie, and that there was some conflict over, you know, whether Jim, Joe, and Phoebe, I'm going to talk about Joe and Phoebe again in a second, whether they could stay in the house and how they left the house and various different things, but I wouldn't categorize it as an attack on Mary Austin. I do feel like, just as two very important people to Freddie, that there was a fair amount of emotions tied up in things, and perhaps there was some lashing out at one another, but that's pretty normal grief response. So I wouldn't level that as some intense criticism at either Jim or at Mary, for that matter. And then the other people that you'll see pop up periodically within Mercury and Me are the other two people who lived in the house with Freddie and Jim. That will be Joe Finelli, Freddie's chef, who was also an ex-boyfriend of his from back in around 1980. They broke up, but then stayed friends, and Joe ended up working for Freddie as his chef, and they were very close. And then last but not least, Peter Phoebe Freestone, who was Freddie's personal assistant, who also wrote a book, which I will review at a later date, as I have it. Again, it came all the way from New Zealand. And that's an episode for a later day, but I also love Phoebe's book. But anyhow, so that's basically who you're going to see. There's a couple other people who pop up. I mentioned Winnie Kirchberger. Oh, and Paul Prenter. Oh, let me touch on Paul Prenter for just a moment. Paul Prenter also pops up periodically within the pages of this periodical. He was Freddie's personal manager, and apparently he didn't like Jim. And then he later sold stories about Freddie to the Sun. And so then he and Freddie never talked again. Also, apparently he tried to talk trash on Jim to Jim's ex-boyfriend, which, Paul Prenter, what you doing? So then basically this kind of charts various different instances in Freddie's life. It's one difference between this and Phoebe's book, without getting too far in the Phoebe's book, is that Phoebe's book is arranged by topic, so there'll be like a chapter on making the albums, then a chapter on touring, a chapter on music videos, whereas Jim's book is chronological, so it'll basically kind of snapshot it kind of by year. Sometimes it's a little difficult to tell when certain things happen because there aren't always as many like firm dates as I would like, but I think that's partially more of an issue with the ghostwriter, I guess, is more of an issue with that. But yeah, so basically, to make a long story short, I think Mercury and Me it's a very solid book. The writing style is a little hit or miss, but again, I'd say that's more of an issue with the co-writer, who apparently was I think they said it was a News of the World reporter who could use some work on his kind of writing style, perhaps. But I think that it's a very heartfelt book. You can definitely tell that Jim put a lot of heart into it. And I think some of the criticism kind of messed with Jim a little bit, because I think where he was sending it was a little different than where a lot of fans received it. And so there is a lot of this sort of stereotype of Jim Hutton just wanted money, he wrote this book, he was cashing in on Freddie's death, etc., etc. When, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily my perception after having read the book. But you can read it and kind of decide for yourself. I will say that one of the highlights of it is that there's a random instance at Live Aid where Jim and Freddie run into Phil Collins, and Phil Collins asked Freddie for an autograph for his kids, and Freddie gave it to him. So, when two stars meet as one. Basically, that's one of my favorite parts in the book. There's a few other random ones, but I don't want to spoil them. You're just gonna have to read for yourself. And then also, just kind of as a caveat, Jim is not the only one of Freddie's former partners to have written a book. There's also another book out that I'll do a video on at some point, I suppose, called This Was the Real Life, The Tale of Freddie Mercury, which is sort of a weird little hodgepodge of a book, because it was a book that was compiled and partially written by David Mins, who was Freddie's first long-term boyfriend in the 70s. And then it was kind of Frankenstein together with parts of a memoir that David Mins was writing. It got kind of tacked on to the beginning. So it's sort of a awkward type of a book. But it was a very interesting read as well. And, well, actually, I'll just kind of touch on it right here. But David Mins' recollection, I would say, of Freddie it has definitely different shades of it than Jim's. Because David Mins, it seems like it was a bad breakup, and there's still a lot of bitterness there, even though they were friends again later. So you can definitely tell that David Mins still holds a grudge towards Jim, although there are some things that you could tell he still has some anger about. Like old lingering fights in which he's sure that he was right and Freddie was wrong. That there is a lot more of that sort of wistfulness, which makes sense, because a lot of people don't really look back on their exes all that fondly, I suppose. But anyway, long story short, I definitely recommend Mercury and Me, and also This Was the Real Life. I think they're both really interesting books, and definitely, Phoebe's book too, although I'm going to go into that in more detail in a later episode, because there is so much to unpack in Phoebe's book. It is a little bit of a longer book than Jim's, and it spans a longer time period, because Jim and Freddie were together from 1984 to 1991, whereas Phoebe started working for Freddie in 1979. So that was they were working together for a long time. So it's more of it also spans more of a stuff, I suppose. But so I'll touch base on Phoebe's book in a later episode. Basically, that's just all I have to say at this moment about Mercury and Me. You can get it on Kindle. It's like $5. Do it. It all goes, apparently all the proceeds from, I forgot to mention, Jim Hutton passed away in 2010, so if you buy his book, unfortunately it's not going to Jim, but he did apparently, I read this somewhere, will all of the royalties from Mercury and Me to the hospital that took care of Jim Hutton when he had cancer and died. So definitely, if you're buying it, even if you hated it, you helped some people with cancer. So you know what's going wrong there. Just go buy it. My next episode, is we're gonna be back to reviewing music again. And that's gonna tackle Double Fantasy, which was an album from 1980 by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. It's a collaborative effort. And so we're gonna go from 1994 back to 1980. And it should be interesting. It was an interesting album, so you're gonna have to just come on out and see what I thought about it. And as always, go donate to the Mercury Phoenix Trust because they are fighting AIDS worldwide. And go buy Jim Hutton's book and also help fight cancer because both of those are good things to do. See ya!